Okay, let's make a start. My name is Paul Oslington. I'm chair of the organising committee of the conference and vice president here in New South Wales. In organising the conference, it's a great opportunity with so many Australian economists gathered to have a look at what's happening in the profession more generally and think together about what's going on and how can we respond and I guess specifically in terms of the Economic Society, because a few of us, Matthew here is our national president, what role the society might have in trying to improve what we do in the economics profession, re-engage the economics profession with policy circles and with other things that matter. So I guess this session is an opportunity to think together about some of those issues. I'm going to hand over to Matthew Butlin. Matthew is, besides being National President or National President of the Economic Society, which, for those of you who aren't that familiar with the structure of the Economic Society, we have state branches and then we have a central council. The central council is made up of representatives from the state branches, a couple of people like the journal editor and the secretary, and then there's and Matthew is National President who's elected. So Matthew is going to introduce our speakers, and very pleased to have you running this session, Matthew.
Great, thanks Paul. Could I make a request? Would all of you in the last 5 rows just move forward? We're hoping to make this a bit of a debate, and the body contact, so to speak, or at least the intellectual contact, will be improved by proximity, I think. So with your indulgence, if you could move forward, that would be much appreciated. So my role as the moderator of the session will be to encourage questions, to pick up, I guess, points that seem to be rather thematic and generally move things along. I've mentioned that the question, the future of the economics profession in Australia, is a matter that's of acute interest and importance to the Economic Society. It goes more or less without saying. And I mentioned that one of our presenters today, John Ludovics, wrote a very timely article with Tony Stokes some years ago that pointed to trends that were happening in the, in fact, long-standing trends that were happening in the economics profession in this country. And some of this has been echoed in the session that we saw, for those of you who are able to attend, the Women in Economics session yesterday, which point to some really quite stark trends in enrolments in high school economics and so on. And we've also seen over the last 10 or so years, I think a significant concentration of the teaching of economics and the study of economics in what I'd loosely describe as our G8 universities, and I think a generally fairly tough environment for those who are outside that group. So I'm looking forward to the conversation here. I'm sure there will be things that come out of this that will be important to your society. By way of background, my background spans both public policy. I have the unusual title, unique in Australia, of being the only red tape commissioner, but you can hear that as being an example of a very applied approach to regulatory reform. And I currently hold other things, including as a professorial fellow at Monash Business School. Anyway, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our 3 speakers. Professor Carol Graham, who has been one of our keynote speakers already, is the Leo Pawlowski Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, the College Park Professor at the University of Maryland, and a Research Fellow at the Institute for the Study of Labour. She's published widely in the fields of happiness, quality of life and safety net programs, amongst many other things. To get a full sense of that, please consult your conference program. She's also worked with the IMF and been a consultant to the World Bank. We're very pleased to have her here, and she has degrees from Princeton, Johns Hopkins and Oxford. John Ludovic, at the end there, for those of you who don't know him, is currently Professor of Economics and Dean at the S.P. Jain School of Global Management and an adjunct professor at UNSW. His career includes appointments at Duke and Wake Forest universities in the US and UNSW, and the University of Western Sydney. His teaching excellence has been reflected in several awards, including the Garrick Citation for Outstanding Contributions to Student Learning. He is an alumnus of Sydney, New England and Duke University. One of the things that I think I'm keen to hear in terms of what John has to say is his deep experience, comes from his deep experience in the teaching of economics across several universities. And we have Alex Milmo in the middle there. Alex is Associate Professor of Economics at the Federation of University and based in Ballarat, I think. He's the President of the History of Economic Thought Society of Australia. His interests include the Australian economics profession and its contribution to society and the history of Australian economic thought. He's a very valued member of the Victorian branch of the ESA, which I remember well, having been the president for a number of years, and is also a freelance journalist. And he's just written and published a book, there we go, on a history of Australasian economic thought. So I've got a panel of three very well qualified people, and without further ado, once again, I'll pass it over to, I think maybe we might do it in reverse order if that suits anyone. So John, please kick off.
Okay, the topic is the future of the economics profession in Australia. That's a very broad topic. If we were going to do this properly, as well as having a majority of academics out the front, we'd have a lot of business economists, we'd have a lot of economists in government, economists in the public service, because they are such an important element of the economics profession. Unfortunately, I'm only going to talk about the situation in academic economics, what's happening in economics in the universities. Ultimately, I guess, all the economists in the business sector and in government went to university, or most of them did, so they're indirectly affected by all this. But, I mean, I hope we can get the contributions from those two groups in the discussion afterwards. I want to start in a positive way. Often we have these sessions and they're very gloomy, they're very negative. So let me start in a very positive way. When we look at the history of economics and what's been happening recently, where recently I specify as since 1980, I think we can be very proud and very positive about what's been happening to the economics profession in general. So not just talking about Australia, in general. Economics has been transformed, and it's been transformed for the better. There was a time when pure theory dominated, when it was given the highest prestige in the profession, pure theory. And it was subject to all sorts of criticisms from various different groups, that the work wasn't particularly policy relevant, wasn't very practical, didn't have empirical roots, that it was just too abstract. I think the profession has listened to that criticism. This is often not noted. It's listened to that criticism and it's reacted positively, but with a long time lag. We would have liked things to move a little quicker, but turning the economics profession around is not easy. But it has been turned around. I think today, economics is the age of the applied economist. Applied work dominates now the top journals. That didn't used to be the case. There's all sorts of interesting things happening, not only in behavioural economics and experimental economics, but in the laboratory experiments, the natural experiments, in development economics, the randomised controlled trials, the building of these huge databases. There is now far more empirical research in economics, less pure theory. Empirical work has become much more prestigious. There's a lot more applied theory going on. In other words, not just someone sitting down with a piece of paper and off they go, but people that are constructing models in relation to specific empirical problems and policy problems. And there's an enormous work that's going on in analysing huge data sets. A lot of the work that's going, or some of the work that's going, is even atheoretical. But most of it is based on some sort of theoretical foundation, although the theoretical foundation may be far more limited than what it was, say, in the 1970s. They are using perhaps simpler econometrics, but they are using a huge number of observations. And they're doing all sorts of interesting, innovative, applied and policy work. I think all that is very good for the profession. It augurs well for the future of our profession. I think much of this can also be said for what's happening in Australia. So I'm very positive about the way that the profession has transformed itself. I think it is doing. We can be very proud of how the profession has transformed itself. Let's now move away from the profession generally and talk about Australia. Australian economists are also doing very interesting applied work of great relevance to policy. But now let's move to the university sector. We do have some good news there. It was recently reported that economics enrolments at the ANU had been turned around. Maybe there's some ANU people here in the discussion that can give us more details. But according to the report, now almost every single undergraduate student at ANU gets a grounding in microeconomics. I mean, I think that's wonderful. That's the complete opposite of what has been happening in other places. How did they do it? Apparently they decoupled themselves from business. A lot of economics is in business disciplines, business faculties, and they moved full force into arts. They offered economics majors, economics minors in arts, and they've attracted a huge number of students. That's just wonderful news. Let's hope we can replicate that elsewhere. What are some other good news that have come across? Well, I think this Women in Economics network is a wonderful initiative, and I applaud the Economic Society for their work in supporting that. I went to a conference at UTS just a week ago, and I thought the most interesting speakers, the most passionate speakers, enthusiastic speakers, were the women economists there talking about what they were doing with this network and building associations with each other and supporting each other. It was a wonderful thing to see. So that's all very valuable. I also have been on a selection committee for a number of years now for a scholarship that the Reserve Bank of Australia gives out. Wonderful initiative. It's given to female high school teachers of economics. So anything we can do to encourage that should be supported. So I start on that positive tone. Despite all that good news, it's in the context that certainly in Australia, in New Zealand, in the UK, that economics in the universities has not fared well. Many economics departments have been shut down, or they've been downsized, or they've been merged into other faculties. Many academic economists are no longer employed at universities, or they're teaching subjects which are not economics, things that they haven't been trained for. Bachelor of Economics degrees have disappeared. Economics majors have disappeared. So that's not good news. Not good news at all. Why? Why these things happened? Well, very quickly. A lot of it has to do with the high schools, and you heard about this yesterday. Economics enrolments in New South Wales high schools are less than a third of what they are in business studies. It used to be the case that a large percentage of those students doing the HSC would do economics. Business studies came along, students voted with their feet, and now only a small proportion of the candidature studies economics. Often in the more selective schools, private schools, the very high quality schools, they're still offering economics, but in many schools you cannot take the subject anymore. And I guess what's also disappointing is of those students that do economics in high school, less than a third are female. Less than a third are female. Okay, obviously not representative in any way, and we just have not done enough to attract women to study economics. At the university level, things have changed. They've uncapped university places. We used to have quotas. Now it's demand determined, and the students have voted very clearly to run away from the study of economics. Why is that? Well, with these extra students that have come to university, entry standards have been lowered, particularly in the low ATAR universities. And these extra students that have come into the university system are less well prepared for university study than the ones that were there before. And economics is a deterrent to them. The sort of intellectual demands, the quantitative skills required, it's not something that attracts students to the study of economics. So, one, the quality of the candidature has declined. Secondly, we have not appropriately catered to a clientele that is less well prepared, to a clientele that some of them have never even done maths in the last 2 years of high school. It makes it very difficult to reach out to them. What's another reason why economics in universities has not fared well? Performance metrics. Performance metrics. University, in this managerial age of universities, managers who are not necessarily academics have tried to find shortcuts to evaluate staff performance, and have usually gone to some very simple metrics. Have you got an ARC grant? If not, out the door. Have you got A and A-starred publications? If not, out the door. What sort of problems has that created for us? It's created a great deal of problems. First of all, in the ERA audits that we've all gone through, the Excellence in Research for Australia audits, compared to other disciplines, economics has been rated very lowly. In the first ERA audit, 2/3 of Australia's universities were regarded as below world standard in economics. The implication from the first era audit was that Australia is generally very poor in economics research by world standards. Do we believe this? We don't. I think economics research in Australia is very healthy. We punch above our weight, but the era audit told us that 2/3 of the universities offering economics was below world standard. In fact, 40% were well below world standard, not just below world standard, well below world standard. Only 4 out of 35 universities got a 4 or 5 ranking, which is the highest ranking. Now, if you're an academic administrator, if you're a vice-chancellor or someone like that, and you saw these results for your economics department, what are you going to do? You're going to say, why should we be putting resources into our economics department, into economics research, when we've got all these other disciplines that are ranked far more highly in terms of world standards, that are getting rankings of 4 and 5? Why should we give any money to those that are ranked 1 or even 2 or perhaps 3? So what we're seeing is that universities throughout Australia are downsizing economics, are giving it very low priority. And that's why you see many of these universities abolishing economics departments, not offering Bachelor of Economics degrees anymore, or even majors. The next point I want to make is that this is happening in economics, but there are many other consequences of the uncapping of student places and the increases in student numbers for other disciplines. We're not unique. We are not unique. In many of the STEM areas, there are declines. In many of the humanities, there are declines. In some disciplines have basically disappeared from all but the metropolitan and Go8 universities. It's very hard, with exception, for students outside the big cities to study anthropology, political science, archaeology, sociology. Those sort of disciplines have disappeared. They're now concentrated in the Go8, the large metropolitan universities. The same thing has happened in economics. There's been a dramatic increase in the concentration of economics teaching, economics research in the Go8 universities. All right, what about the future then in economics? We look at the bright spots, the issues that I started talking about, and we cling to them. We hope that they're going to be the future. Certainly in the Go8, things seem to be going quite nicely, not outside the Go8. Perhaps we can be optimistic and say, well, this is just cyclical, okay? We might be on the downturn now, but it'll pick up. Or perhaps we'll say, well, if we're not producing so many economics graduates, less supply in the market, their value will go up, and therefore more students will want to study it. Maybe we take that perspective. But I think there are serious issues with economics being concentrated in a small number of institutions. I like to think that economics has public good characteristics. We talk about how important it is to have financial literacy. I agree. I think it's just as important to have economic literacy. I think the fundamental concepts of microeconomics and even some macro is crucial to a good decision making in government, in the private sector, in our own lives. Notions of opportunity cost, even the demand curve slope down and supply curve slope up, is essential for everybody to know about. The diminution of the opportunity of people to study economics, I think, is something to be lamented. I think ultimately our problem has been a lack of collective action. We are not good at collective action, action that promotes the economics profession in this country. We are like the models we construct about the individual actor. We know what's good for us, or we know what's good for our department, but we don't have a broader perspective of what's good for the economics profession in Australia as a whole. That's where there's a role for the Economic Society, there's a role for many other organisations to make the case that economics is important and it's of value to society as a whole. Thank you.
I occasionally go to airports, and it was a few years ago I was looking for Paul Krugman's book called End of Depression Now. And I looked in the business section, it wasn't there, but it was in the self-help, health awareness section. I thought, oh, it's completely mislabeled. Anyway, I thought depression, because I think John was depressing us a little bit, but what he's saying is completely true, and I could listen to him for much longer. I work at Federation University, which is, we had an ERA ranking just a couple of years ago, and there's only 4 economists there, but we managed to produce 50 articles, and we actually got graded. But we were very regretful we did that, because when the rankings came out, we were ranked at 1, which is well below world standard. And I thought, well, that's the last time we're going to put in for this ERA thing, you know, after working so hard to produce 50 journal articles, me and 3 others and a few research students. Anyway, I'm just going to talk to some slides. Some of it John's already said. I'll make a few more provocative comments. I might be a little bit more upbeat than John. 20 years ago, there was a survey of economic enrolments done by Phil Lewis and Keith Norris, and Phil's in the audience. He was in the audience earlier. There he is. The Economic Society commissioned a survey of this problem of economic enrolments, which was first identified, I might say, by myself. Way back in 1995, I wrote an article talking about how business schools were beginning to marginalize economics, and so I was a sort of the Cassandra of this problem. Anyway, I was talking to Phil last night, and he said that when they did the survey, they just thought it was a cyclical problem. They didn't know it was actually the start of going down the precipice. So it's 20 years ago since that study, and as John said, there's been a number of economic departments that have rather dramatically and graphically folded, one of which was John, who used to work at University of Western Sydney, and then La Trobe and Canberra, where Phil Lewis used to work, and a number of other economic departments that have been encased in business schools. The recent survey data, or as best as we can get it, is that economic enrolments still occupying about 1.5% of total Australian degree enrolments, with females making up about 40% of that. Okay, and then we did a study, the last time we did any sort of empirical study on this was to see if there was any GFC revival in economic enrolments in Australia. And a paper I did with Jackie Tuck, we found no spin-off effect, no positive spin-off effect, whereas in Britain and America there was. As John was talking about, there's been a calamitous decline in Year 12 and Year 11 economics in Australia, and I always felt that linkage between secondary school and tertiary was always important, because that's why I became an economist. Was important, and I did write a paper about that way back in 2004. But it's now been given a lot of attention, and I'm happy to report that the Reserve Bank of Australia, which is based in Sydney, have taken up their cudgels, and they're really putting a lot of resources into it. There's this monthly magazine they're called Currency, and there's a five-page spread on how they've got these economic ambassadors going around or having workshops where they invite secondary school teachers to Sydney, to the Reserve Bank headquarters, where they basically have a one-day retreat educating secondary school teachers about economics, how monetary policy works, etc. So the RBA are really doing a very good thing there. And I mean, the problem is now identified, and they're doing something about it. The RBA, in fact, have always done that in Australia. They've always been a great promoter of economics education. In fact, if you read my book, I talk about that quite a bit, how the RBA was always bringing out economists, having workshops, having an excellent website, which I always introduce my students to. So they're doing a good thing. The funny thing of all this decline in economics, but particularly at school, is our appetite for economics and our hunger for economic news is undiminished. In fact, it might even be increasing. You know, you just read the local newspaper headlines, and it's always an economic story. We have an insatiable appetite in this country for economics. As regards the future, well, the Economic Society, under our gracious president there, took the initiative of actually getting a women's economic network up, which was a wonderful thing. But there's two other organisations. There's the ESSA, which stands for the Economic Student Society of Australia, and they're, I think, a Melbourne-based group. They're at Melbourne and they're at Monash University. And then there's a group called the Young Economists Network. And these three strands will basically mean that the Economic Society does have a future, because they're all young people coming in, and they'll revive the Economic Society. I did actually predict, when I was writing that book, that I thought the Economic Society was actually becoming a moribund institution. But with these three rivers of young talent coming into the profession, I think that's going to save the Economic Society. And not just that, but there'll be much more gender balance. On gender balance, the RBA, as John mentioned before, makes a great play about the gender imbalance. For every one girl student doing Year 12 economics, there's 2 boys. So they're trying to address that problem, as is the Economic Society. And the RBA's program is called the Immersion Economics Program, a bit like John the Baptist. I don't think it's a cold water immersion, it's a gentle immersion. But as I said, this goes back to the age of Nugget Coombs, and even before then, where the RBA promotes economics education in this country. Let me be a little bit provocative and say, well, the RBA is part of the official family running monetary policy in Australia, interest rates, etc., liquidity, cash flows and all that sort of stuff. What's the Federal Treasury doing about all this problem? Nothing. If you look on their website, it's not the most attractive website. There's nothing for young students or for teachers or lecturers. It's not as attractive as the RBA website. And so I asked the question, what is the Federal Treasury doing about promoting economics education? Given that they are a great, they recruit economics talent from all of the universities. I don't think there's anyone here from the Treasury. Here's, getting back to that female-male imbalance, this is some data done by one of my honours students. She's looking at economic enrolments, and you can see that male-female imbalance is still there, and in fact, if anything, it's actually getting worse. If you look at that blue line there, you can see that the imbalance is actually increasing. The blue is females, and the grey one is males. And that's Australian economic enrolments, econometrics enrolments, but not including Melbourne University. Now that's the latest data we have got, came from the Department of Employment and Education, etc. So we've still got a problem there. That imbalance there is still exacerbating, despite this rather delayed response we're doing with the RBA, the Women in Economics Network, and the Economic Society dealing with that gender imbalance problem. I teach economics at Federation University, and we used to actually have micro one semester, macro the next semester. This year, for the first year, I'm going to be teaching an economic principles course, which is basically only 12 weeks. And in fact, it's actually only 11 weeks, because you can't introduce new material in week 12, because then there'll be no tutorial. So I've got to actually compress micro and macro into an 11-week course. And I feel very sorry for these young students, because as John said, they're coming from a low socioeconomic background. They haven't done economics before at school, probably weak on mathematics, even though we don't use that much maths in my course, Principles of Economics. And, you know, I'm thinking here of George Stigler's admonition or advice that the need for economic literacy. If we look at the problems that Australia's got with, the smashed avocado generation, having no chance of buying a house, and having to pay a higher HEX debt, and then having to look after the oldies and all this sort of stuff, intergenerational theft. Maybe we should recall George Stigler's advice that people need to be economically educated because these millennials are going to face a tough time. They might actually not be as rich as their parents. And that goes back to also financial illiteracy. Now, a couple of years ago, ACARA, which is the Australian Curriculum, what's that stand for, John? The Australian Curriculum and Regulatory Authority. They had the brainwave idea of bringing in a business and economics curriculum to young primary school kids from year 5 to year 8. That's grade 5 to Form 2. And John was involved, as was I, 2 other economists, Ed Nelson from Wollongong and Anita Forsyth from Monash. And we used to have to come up to Sydney, and we had these long sessions developing a curriculum for young minds. We're trying to follow the American example, because in America they do, some states in America actually have this. And we actually put it up at all these educational consultants and designers, etc. And I called it Kidonomics. For some strange reason, they made me the lead writer, which I could never understand. But anyway, I was made the lead writer. Anyway, this was from the previous Labour government had brought this in. It was to the Australian curriculum. So they were going to have business and economics. Well, blow me down, the Labour government got defeated in the election, and then the Abbott government decided to have a review of this. And the 3 people who had, they did a review of the business and economics curriculum, and there was 2 Griffith University economists actually said the curriculum was beyond salvage. So we were actually shooting ourselves in our own foot. Now, why they said that, I don't understand. I'm still puzzled by it today. It was as if it wasn't a left-wing heterodox conspiracy. It was just simple economics, building block economics for kids. And yet they saw something more sinister in it. So the whole thing was torpedoed, beyond salvage. And we also had Judith Sloan slagging off the report in the Australian. And we were basically trying to just bring a little bit of economics now to primary school kids when they're about 10, 11, 12. So I don't know what that was about. Regarding, in Australia at present, there's a lot of worries about automation and, technological change and all this stuff. Where I work in the business school, we have a lot of people doing business and law and accountancy, not economics. And I do read that there's going to be a lot of digitization, and a lot of these legal jobs and accounting jobs might actually be eaten up by automation. I don't think you could say the same thing about economics. Recall Keynes' description of the master economist: to be numerate and literate, to have your ears close to the ground, to be political, a good networker. So I don't think economists are ever going to be replaced by machines. I'd like to see that day happen. I don't think that's ever going to happen. As I said, I'm going to be a little bit more optimistic than John. I think that these changes that the Economic Society is doing, what the RBA is doing, are good things. But nonetheless, John did mention that in Australia there's ample evidence of economics becoming an elite subject, basically taught at the leading universities. That's how it was way back in the 50s and the 60s, and it's going back to that. In Australia, we have 8 lead universities plus UTS. That's about 9. It's a bit like the English Premier League. If you're in the Premier League, you hire stars and rock economists to raise your publication and your A-star journals, etc. So it's a bit like that. If you're in a metro university, second rank, or a regional university like me, then economics will just be a marginal subject. As I said, we lost ground last year. My university, strangely, reviewed its MBA, and it took economics out of the core, which I thought was an absolutely disastrous move. I told the dean, look, you can't have people doing an MBA without any sense of economic and financial literacy, but I wasn't listened to. So, as I said, I'm a Cassandra. What would I know anyway? One other comment, I've got 2 last comments. In Australia, you'd have to be blind to see that Business schools is now the trend. At Monash University, the Faculty of Economics now has basically rewritten its history and said, we are the Monash Business School, and our vintage goes back to 1962. So they're basically now doing a little bit of Stalin and rewriting history. So business schools is all the rage here, and that's good, I suppose, but as I said, economics is sort of shunted aside. But the thing is, they do attract the best and the brightest, and even the best and the brightest economics students. I put forward the suggestion that maybe they can be somewhat corrupted by the business world, so that the Federal Treasury and the RBA and government departments that show in public service, New South Wales Public Service, will be denuded of the best. The best will go to KPMG, Ernst & Young, the big banks. So that's just something I want to throw out there, because it used to be the case when I did my economics that the best and the brightest went either to the Treasury up in Canberra or the very best to the RBA up in Sydney. Don't know if that's still the case today. My last point, being a historian of economics, is that economic history, we haven't mentioned that much, it actually has come back, even though departmentally it's been wiped out. Economic history has crept back into the curriculum, even though they don't actually have the organizational form. It is creeping back more into journals and even into some teaching, and that's a good thing. And that is something that's happening in Australia as we speak. So that's me, folks. Thanks very much.
Okay, well, I feel a little awkward on this panel because all I know about Australian economics I've learned in the past 2 days, and a lot right now. So that's a caveat, although I've been very impressed by the number of people I've met at the conference and the range of topics and the open-mindedness and willingness to self-reflect, which I don't think you would see as much at the American Economics Association, for example. And the other sort of caveat is that I'm a complete outlier. So I was one of the early economists to work on happiness. I've done all kinds of work on safety nets in poor countries. I'm not very good at macro. And I really don't like being put into, preset intellectual boxes. So my comments, I think, will reflect a bit of that. But listening to these presentations, and also the one yesterday on women in economics, and seeing some of the trends and the concerns about what's going on with economics in Australia, I don't think they're unique to Australia. I think they probably cross borders. I think the sort of what's offered in quality universities versus lower ranked universities is an issue that's certainly not unique to Australia. I think the sort of the tension between business schools and economics is also not new. One of the things that we often comment on in the US is that the business schools have the luxury of teaching the most kind of interesting and out-of-the-box courses because the bread and butter stuff has to be taught in the econ departments, and the business students take those there, and then they get all these hotshot, expensive professors in the business school. So some of these tensions are, I think, are very much not unique to here and are more generic to the field. I want to talk maybe a little bit about some underlying issues that I think may reflect at least the teaching part of this equation and the PhD student part of the equation. So on the one hand, I really agree with both presentations about there are many reasons to be really optimistic and excited about what's going on in economics. It's a really, really different field from what it was before. It's much more empirical. It's much less sort of theoretical and removed. It's taken on a whole new host of topics. So labor economics has gotten much more exciting. There's economics of education, of social policy, of crime. The sort of range of topics that economists cover, I think, is almost threatening to other social sciences because we have and can cast such a wide net, I think, because of really good tools, methodological and also thinking frames. There's also just been a whole change and introduction of many new exciting approaches. Behavioral economics, we had some of that yesterday. And it's not just in academics, it's in policy, having real influences. There's a behavioral insights team here, there's one in Britain, there's something similar, less public in the US government, just because the US government is so divided right now. But there are similar things going on. Well-being, a field that I helped start, was laughed at 10 years ago, and now it's, it's in a lot, almost, not all, but many mainstream journals, including the AER, have an article with well-being or happiness or something related to the field in almost every issue. The number of students is increasing. It's actually starting to influence policy. Again, even in the US, there are different official statistics that now have 1 or 2 or 3 kinds of well-being metrics in their statistics, and they're really beginning to affect policy analysis quietly, but it's happening. That couldn't have happened even 10 years ago. There are also, I mean, maybe I'm biased because of the field I work in, but there's also a lot of really exciting new collaboration in economics with psychologists, with geneticists, with biologists. You know, the range, if you look at some of the newer topics in neuroscience in economics, it's a really exciting field. And the big data work that I think John mentioned is also really exciting. Visualizations, mapping, the large ends that allow you to do so much more with much simpler econometrics and just really look at what the data tells you in a robust way. So all of that from the perspective of just to look at the field and what people with freedom to do what they can do and publish where they want to publish can do is enormous. So the challenge, though, I think, is that how we teach, how we tenure, how some of the mainstream journals are still stuck in very old boxes. And for senior people, established economists who don't have to worry about it, who can publish where they want, think how they want, it sort of doesn't matter. But if you're a PhD student, or even a college student, and particularly in the US, like here, the problem is worse in second-tier universities, the way economics is taught is turgid. It would turn anybody off. You know, it's just not a surprise that you see enrollments declining, particularly when, for example, business majors offer sort of a mock version, economics light, but a lot of related topics. And it's not just in teaching. I think it is, there's still just sort of certain frames and assumptions that are still, that can be really dominant, that I think not only turn off potentially good students, and what I'm seeing in the US a lot is kids going to do public policy degrees rather than econ degrees because they're more flexible, they're more interdisciplinary, they cover a wider range, and they still pick up econometrics tools and quantitative skills and often even get jobs in econ departments. So there's sort of kind of a mainstream versus the rest problem going on. And in that mainstream, or the old way of thinking, I think what we've got is, one, a huge obsession with method over substance. Method matters. You know, it's incredibly important. But when you get to the point that, you know, you have a graduate student come in and say, I'm going to instrument, you know, the change in crime rates in eastern Argentina with sunshine days. What is that? I mean, there's just there's an incredible amount of that. People, you know, I have to have an instrument to pass this class or to get published. So the instrument becomes more important than the problem you're trying to answer, and may have, it's you know, goes far out there. That's just one example. Another one is, as wonderful as randomized controlled trials are and experiments, it's now gotten to the point that if you don't have an experiment or a randomized controlled trial, you can't get published in a lot of journals. The problem with that is the randomized control experiments and randomized control trials and experiments, both of which are incredibly exciting methodological tools, and I've used them for some things in some studies. They narrow the range of topics that you can look at and think about in a dramatic way. It's not clear they're replicable. It's not clear they're scalable. They tell us what works. They don't tell us why it works. They don't tell us why would it work in a different context. Angus Deaton's famous critique of this approach in his American Economics Association presidential address maybe 5 years ago was how limiting this was to our thinking and to thinking in economics. And related to that, if to publish in sort of the mainstream journals that you need to publish in to get tenure, at least in the States, if you don't establish causality with your data, it doesn't matter, it's not publishable, versus an association that's incredibly provocative, that eventually over time you may be able to establish causality. Or maybe you can't, but it's underlying a fundamental societal problem. Again, it's sort of irrelevant if you can't prove causality, and you won't get published in the journals you need to get published in to get tenure, at least in mainstream US schools. So what I think this means is for upcoming PhDs, this narrows their thinking, the topics they can look at, and in the end, their creativity, and for a substantial part of their creative years. So it's not just a small thing. It's not just high school or college. It's really sort of boxing people in and I think here is where econ departments in the States, compared to, say, public policy schools or business schools, do lose people, right? Except for some of the very best and the brightest, of course, go into econ departments, but some really interesting students go. Some of the best students go to the Kennedy School or to business schools. Some really, really top economists in the U.S. who publish in academic economic journals teach at business schools because they're more free to do what they want, work on what they want to. For college kids, and let alone high school kids, but even college kids, the approach to teaching, which is not only focused on some of these very narrow assumptions, but also just on old models, memorization of taking the derivative or whatever it is, which you have to learn, but without the broader context, without introduction into what some of these other areas of exploration are. They don't get what we get. They don't, when they're taught intro to micro or whatever, they get the static models, rational actor, revealed preferences, that's it. They don't know that the field is exciting and it's got all these other applications. And so by the time they're going to be turned off before they go a step further. So I think that's a big problem. And again, I think it's most reflected in second-tier schools. I don't know what the solution there is, but it is, it's a problem. So the other thing is that that one of the things I think maybe that is a potential solution, and it came up also in yesterday's panel, and I've thought a lot about it, is that the sort of old school, very standard assumptions about Homo economicus took Homo sapiens out of the equation, right? And yet most people, some of the most, that could go on to do incredibly talented economics degrees at college level, they care about people. They want to, they need the connection with how do actual humans behave, right? And so, again, at the high end of the field, that's come back in through behaviorals, through well-being, through all kinds of things. But in the teaching level, and even, first few years of PhD level, I don't think that's present enough. I don't think people have the opportunity to do a dissertation in behavioral economics, or it's rare, right? I think that's, so I think there's all kinds of reasons to be excited about the field now, both in Australia and elsewhere. A lot, for all the reasons that have been on the table. On the other, there's this sort of paradox that to get there, to get to the point that you're allowed to do all these exciting things, you spend most of your studying years in these old intellectual boxes and paradigms, and breaking out of them is very, very risky. You have to be crazy like I was. So that's a warning. But anyway, so I hope that provides a little bit more of a general picture. Again, I really, really applaud how self-reflective you all are as a society, as a group of economists, versus sort of being it seems to me that in our economic societies, there's much more debate over who's got the exact right approach and everybody else is wrong. So this is really a refreshing, wonderful conference.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carol. And I think Paul should take a big bow in terms of this and many other things in relation to the conference. Now we have an opportunity for questions. We have a roving mic. Who's got the... Hang on. There it is. Right. Thank you. Okay. If you would please just quickly identify yourself and then launch into your question.
Abbas Walatkani from Swinburne University of Technology in Melbourne. I would like to make a few observations. I really enjoyed the presentation for the panel members to highlighting a very important trend in our discipline. Once upon a time, we had about 400, 500 delegates at the Australian Conference of Economists, and now we get only 150 or 200 if we are very lucky. And also it was, today we realize that yes, RBA is doing a lot for our discipline, and maybe other departments are not doing much, but why don't we have a look at ourselves? I looked at the back of the sponsors. I don't see even one single university. I don't know whether it's a typo or whether I missed something. So I think in our discipline, our research agenda is mainly driven in what's happening in North America. Our journal ranking, we all agree that if we don't have A stars or A-rank journals, and most of these A stars are not in Australia. And most of our politicians and decision makers, they can't understand American Economic Review or Econometrica. They may understand Agenda or Australian Economic Review, but nobody is encouraged to publish in those journals. It seems that we go from one extreme, that a conference paper or a non-referee publication is the same as American Economic Review 5 or 6 years ago, to another extreme that everybody is forced to publish in A stars, and without passing the the relevancy test. It's a bit sad that most of these some of our A-star publishers, they don't contribute to the conversation, and I have this experience talking to one of them. They didn't even hear what is the conversation. So I think I would like to see ACE to be sponsored, to be based at a university, and instead of looking at treasuries or RBA, see what we are doing to our discipline. Because at the end of the day, even those people are enjoying being at group of 8. If the declining numbers continues, the karma will come back and bite them.
I'd like to reserve the last word on that, if I may, but pass it back to colleagues.
Sure. Just a very quick word on A and A starred. I agree with what you've said, but it's also important to note what proportion of our journals are ranked A and A star. Okay, the proportion in economics is far lower than in other disciplines. In the Australian Business Deans Council list, only about a quarter of the applied economics journals are A and A starred. In management disciplines, the figure is between 30 and 40%. In law, it's something like 45%. Now, why in other disciplines are their journals of such higher quality than our journals? And I suggest they're not at all of higher quality. But because we've got such a small proportion of journals that are ranked A and A starred, we lose out.
Alex, did you...
Well, I would just like to see that Abby is the head of the department at Swinburne, and they've actually brought back the economics major. You looked at your website recently. You've gone outside the business school into the arts, and you're actually expanding your department, which is a good sign. So again, there's some good signs there. As regards business schools, I forgot to mention the Australian Business Deans Council, and what John was saying, that am I correct in saying that it's only in the business school, only in business disciplines that we actually rank journals. So do we do it in history and philosophy, or is it just in the business schools?
Well, I think the the Australian Business Deans Council has taken this ranking very seriously.
They have.
You remember it, the ARC
Yeah.
said, no, we're not going to do this anymore
Yeah.
because it leads to all sorts of undesirable practices.
right.
And they specifically mentioned
Yeah.
the fact that giving staff quotas of A and A-star journals to achieve was detrimental.
Yeah.
Yet the Australian Business Deans Council has just taken over the ranking exercise.
Yeah.
There are ranking exercises in the other disciplines as well, maybe not as strict and
Not as strict,
as
but-
professional as
yeah.
the way the Business Deans Council does it.
Yeah, and even the Economic Record had to struggle to get an A ranking. I think Matthew might speak on that, but they wanted to. The Economic Record wanted an A-star ranking so to get more quality submissions, but the Australian Business Deans Council regarded it as an A, and then it was they took it over to a couple of American professors, and they confirmed that status. So I think the Australian Business Deans Council are the enemy. You know, and yet every business school is a member of it, right? And the poison they do, the destruction they do. The other last thing is, in my book, I only wrote up the history of Australasian economics up to the year 2000, because if I'd gone beyond 2000 to 2015, I would have to talk about that ERA and how Australian economic research was then downgraded because all the top-shot academics would want to write more about American stuff or use American data. And so I didn't mention that there is an incentive now to not publish on Australian economic issues, applied economic issues. And I had an article with Anita Dorasamy on that last year. But my book, which I'm flogging my book again, my book only went up to the year 2000 before the ERA poison started to seep into Australian academia.
Did you want to say anything specifically?
Yeah, just in relation to the conference, we certainly were keen to have it at one of the universities, but one of the real struggles facing the society, both at the Central Council level and at our state level, is the disengagement of academic economists from the society. So, if you've got a performance evaluation criteria in one of those departments, it's about A and A-star journals and about ARC grants. You look at the society and you think, well, what's in it for me? The society's about broader engagement, about a whole lot of other things than A and A-star journals, although we certainly respect that. I'm not wanting to knock that in the ARC game. It's just there's more to being an economist than that. So that's increasingly the logic from the younger economists in those departments. We have had a little more engagement from some of the heads, particularly at Sydney and Macquarie. UNSW is mixed. We've had a bit of turnover at the senior levels there. UTS, zero engagement at all. So in the end, we're having the conference in the Sofitel because none of the universities were prepared to have it on their campus. And we're hoping, those of you who are in departments, it's one thing to get the discussion going about the society, encourage your colleagues to join. Really we can re-engage with the academic part of our profession, particularly the senior academic part of our profession. If it's useful to them, if the word is out there. So help us do that. And but in terms of this conference, there were certainly serious attempts to engage with the universities, but not a lot of uptake.
So we've had, particularly around the conference, quite a variable recent history about who we can engage with and who's enthusiastically supported over the last few years. It's been clear that we've had a university that's picked up and said, yes, that's what we want to do, and that's been a great thing. I think what Paul and the organisers have done has been terrific, and I want to acknowledge the breadth of the discussions and so on. In terms of what your society is doing, we are acutely aware of some of the challenges, and in fact every one of the ones that's been mentioned. So quite specifically, in addition to engaging with the business deans, which has been an issue when these assessments come up, We have also been setting out to do what we can to lift the ranking of your journal, your principal journal, The Record, as far as possible into an A-star category. We have been encouraging, you may have seen in the pattern of major prizes, particularly the Swan Prize, to encourage the study of economics, including applied to Australian problems, and it was very deliberately named after Trevor Swan, who, although he did a very important piece in theory, was actually one I remember being taught at MIT by Rudy Dornbush a long time ago. And it was that sort of thing that we're trying to encourage. We're really also operating, I think, at two ends. The first is the attractiveness of economics to people more generally, and within the folks that have decided to get into economics, to make sure that we're operating at the end with the Young Economist Network, and especially the very young folks at uni, particularly in Melbourne at the moment, and of course the women in economics. So if you like, there's a question about who we bring in and encourage. At the other end, we have also deliberately, particularly over the last 3 years, broadened our awards and acknowledgement of whom we think have made really quite outstanding contributions. And that's the genesis, by the way, of the Distinguished Public Policy Fellow Award, which is quite deliberately crafted so that it would include non-academic economists, and I'm very pleased the first one was Gary Banks. So there's a lot of stuff in between about what the society can do, and particularly in encouraging at the level of departments. That's difficult for us to reach, and I think structurally the point that Paul has made, which is the partial withdrawal of academic economists, I can report with some pride, I think, or pleasure rather than pride, I had nothing to do with it, that most, well, over half of the branch presidents are actually academic economists, but it remains an ongoing challenge. So I'm encouraged by the comments that have been made about the structural optimism, which I agree with. I agree with the challenge about the way we teach economics. I speak as somebody who came into economics at university, so I didn't go through high school with this. But, and I do think that that's a major challenge for us to motivate what is, I think, essentially a very practical, theoretical and systems thinking to the sorts of problems that we have today to deal with. So I think you raised some really good points. As a minister once said to me when I complained about all the opposition that he had and going forward, and his answer was to look me in the eye and said, well, here we are. So the challenge for us, I think, is how we respond to that. And as I say, I'm deeply encouraged by the optimistic view that is coming through. Carol, I'm sorry, it was a loss of manners. Was there anything you would like to say?
No, I don't think I'm equipped to.
I thought that might have been the case, but anyway.
Sorry.
Please.
Yeah. Glenn Whitworth, Centre of Policy Studies. Firstly, congratulations on a splendid session and excellent comments from the panel. When Carol was talking about tenure, I was thinking, what has this got to do with economics advancing humanity, advancing the cause of society? And I'm not convinced that the conditions for tenure getting published in A&A Star journals do a lot of that. That's just a comment, but I've got a deeper question, which is a bit of a firecracker. Does the ERA process serve any purpose other than preserving the G of 8 cartel?
I don't want to handle that one. Paul, do you want to have a go at that one?
I mean, I think there are some good things about the ERA. And I think one of the things that's happening with the ARA next time around is that, as well as the focus on quality, there's also a equally weighted now exercise in the next ERA about engagement, take-up of economics. They're still working out the metrics for that, but I think that's a healthy trend, and that provides some opportunities, I think, for the society to re-engage with the profession. So I don't think there's certainly some things that are pretty crooked about the ERA, but there's also some good things and some signs of hope there. And I think, like everything, well, if there are problems with it, now let's write to our MPs, let's lobby the relevant people in the ARC, and get a better system.
My problem with the ERA, I have to say, is that it's a very partial measure of what economists contribute. And particularly, I have an association with the Melbourne Institute, and it will be the archetype of a business, of an organisation that's achieved excellence, partly through the academic, importantly through academic contributions, but actually very well engaged with a wide range of organisations, both departments at Commonwealth and state level, and does a lot of policy relevant stuff, which is very difficult to rate in many cases in conventional measures. They and the University of Melbourne are grappling with this, and I think in a pretty healthy way. As Paul's suggesting, I don't think they've yet come to a landing on this, but at least the problem is recognised. And it's quite clear that in my view at least, that the biased assessment has actually had quite a deleterious effect on the study of applied economics, and particularly, given it's my passion, public policy.
That was a good question. I had an article with Anita Dorasamy in the Economics and Labour Relations Review. Sorry I didn't ask that question. It's a lovely question. I'm lucky because I'm getting near retirement, and I'm not going to publish any more journal articles. I'm doing books. So I don't have to play the game. I'm lucky being at a regional university because they don't really expect you to publish A-star and get an ARC grant. So I'm happy as Larry, but I've gone into books.
Just one final word, just following on from what Carol said, the difference between association and causality. In the countries I'm aware of, Australia and the UK with their research assessment exercise, and New Zealand, there's a very strong association between those research assessment exercises and the decline of economics departments, economics enrolments, economics majors. I won't say it's causality, it's association.
Thanks, guys. Bodhi Tamburan from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. I just wanted to say thanks again for all the speeches. I'm sort of coming at this from a different perspective because it's been a while since I was at university, but I can definitely attest to the increased appetite that we're seeing in the Australian Bureau of Statistics for skills in economics, and actually painting an economic picture from the statistics that we're producing, and that's sort of recently been exhibited. We've recently had a new position created, a chief economist within the Australian Bureau of Statistics, which is, I think, a really positive sign. I guess my question is, what I haven't seen is sort of the promotion of some of the new fields, and I think it might be an area we could sort of tap into to increase demand at the lower levels of university. So just wondering, are we doing anything to promote some of the new fields of study that are being looked at? It may be a way to encourage enrolments for people who would normally be entering into some of the social disciplines, because it's sort of an area I don't know if we've explored in depth.
Okay, so just on the ABS, I think a lot of people don't appreciate the wonderful work historically that the ABS has done in their statistical analysis, particularly the purchasing power parity stuff that they pioneered, the work on well-being that they did, I mean, the ABS has a wonderful international reputation for advancing that sort of work, and it's certainly it's not well known, the wonderful things they do. So I'll leave it at that point.
Oh, just maybe to echo that in a way, statistics offices are, by starting to collect new kinds of data, in a way push the field further. I mean, it may be first in policy, but at the end, academe, if it's going to be relevant, also has to respond. I think the big challenge, I'm not sure anybody's answered it yet, is the question you asked, how do we start to get some of the new fields, new kinds of thinking, in from the bottom up so that kids are exposed, and particularly, I mean, the kids at the top universities get exposed to everything. It's sort of the more general consumption of economic knowledge at the high school and college level more generally. How do we diffuse that? And in fact, one way I think it will gradually happen is through statistics. So by you all having a module on well-being, the UK, the ONS, putting well-being statistics out there annually as part of all the other statistics, the average person eventually becomes a consumer. I think there's a big learning process there. So one of the things I worry about is how do we translate these well-being statistics into things that the public can consume? So, for example, if we know that national well-being levels don't move much, so you say, well, average levels of life satisfaction in the U.S. actually went down last year. I know they went down for many reasons, but from 7.1 to 6.2. So scholars know that's a big movement in a national average number. The average Joe on the street wouldn't know if that was nothing, good, or bad. But some of that is just exposure to the new statistics. So the average Joe on the street knows that a 1% increase in the rate of unemployment is a bad thing. They know that a 0.1 increase is kind of irrelevant. They couldn't tell you how many people got unemployed, and that actually the unemployed pool is pretty small, and a 1% move is not that many people, but they know it's a significant move. So some of it is just the dissemination of information, new ideas and approaches through simple statistics that people consume every day as just average readers of the newspaper. So you all have a big role to play.
Just in Victoria, in Year 12 economics, that they have brought in behavioural economics into the curriculum. So that's a good positive sign.
Thank you.
The other thing is that the first economist in the Australian Public Service was an economist, but he was working in the Bureau of Census or Statistics then. His name was Rowan Wilson.
It was indeed.
Oh, hi.
Sorry, I beg your pardon.
No, right. Preston Samasiros, University of Tasmania. Without discounting the obvious importance that good economic intuition is central to good economics education, economics undoubtedly becoming more of a quantitative field. Why aren't we seeing economics departments try to attract more of the students who are going to engineering into the science disciplines to come over and use those maths and STEM skills in fields like economics?
Who feels qualified to answer that way? But feel free to offer an opinion.
Alex is an expert on this.
Well, look, the problem we were referring to earlier about getting more girls or females to do economics, that's very noble, but they would have to do some mathematics in Year 12 before you could actually overcome that hurdle. As regards your proposal, I remember I used to teach economics to engineering students, even economics to nursing students at one stage, and economics to catering students. But all that sort of it's retreated. We only just teach economics to business school, and even that's a very modest diet now. That's more a sort of a question that you have to ask departmental heads. I'm not a departmental head.
It's good.
One little theme, I think, in the discussion is that the business schools don't love us. And it's sometimes I think economists are a bit like an abused wife, that you keep coming back to the person who beats you up every night. And I think one of the lessons is, you know, getting out into the arts faculty, getting out into the world a bit more. You know, maybe we should look at that. I think it's probably going to improve the economics we teach if we're engaging with a wider group of people than just, you know, first-year business students in a service course. Let's sort of, you know, widen our horizons a bit beyond, you know, the grim world of business, sometimes not in our business school, but the sometimes grim world of business schools.
Well, Abby was here before. You've got economics for aviation students, haven't you, and all that sort of stuff at Swinburne?
There are some students who are doing a double major, or at least do economics as an elective as part of their course. Yeah.
There can be some, sorry, just an observation. There's partly a retrieval there. I mean, my recollection of grad school, and I think it's still reasonably true, is that it was quite remarkable how many failed astrophysicists, physicists generally, engineers and other ones, actually wound up in economics, which led me to think that there's probably a theorem that some of our best economists are actually failed something else. But that gets the cross interdisciplinary point in part. Sorry.
That's right. Mark Jennings from Department of Social Services. It was mentioned before about the trend towards, or I guess, driving away from a more theoretical base into a more applied base for economics. That's been over the last couple of decades. I'm just wondering what's driving that exactly, and I guess what that means for the future of the field. Is that part of a broader scepticism towards the truth claims of economics, or is that more of a skills-based kind of thing that's driving that? I'm just curious as to your thoughts. Thanks.
I think it's, on the one hand, just the sort of the move to so many new topics, and so, you know, one theory, or it's harder to have an overarching theory, although I think it's important to have theory informing research always. But the other, I think, has to do with a lot of skepticism of many failed theories, particularly a lot in macro disasters that sort of ignored individual human behavior, contagion, all kinds of things because of just, you know, being very distant theory. And even at the micro level, I think the sort of underpinning of standard revealed preferences approaches, which are still very relevant to many, many questions, but miss the boat on many others, has also sort of challenged the faith in, you know, a particular theory, so to speak. But I think it's important that that does not result in the importance of theory informing research and research design also being thrown out with the bathwater, so to speak.
I think we have time for just one more question.
Yes, well, I'm Jenny Lai from the University of Melbourne, and actually my point was a comment. It's a comment back to the previous person. We actually at the University of Melbourne have just introduced a Masters of Applied Econometrics specifically for STEM students, trying to target STEM students. In addition, by the way, we are in a business school, I guess, but we also offer economics major to art students, and we actually have a number of art students doing honours from arts. So I just thought you might be interested. So
Well, thank you for that.
There's one more.
Okay, one more, but that really is it.
Okay, I'll try to be short. Gigi Foster, University of New South Wales. I wanted to go back to this question of high school education and economics and in general. So I spoke at the HSC Economics Teachers Conference, professional conference in New South Wales a couple of years ago. And they seemed very, very receptive to sort of academic input into what they're teaching. But the system by which curricula are set for teaching business studies and economics seem completely impenetrable. There doesn't seem to be any willingness or welcoming of academic input. Even if we did want to broaden the curriculum, I've suggested on other fora that we could, for example, try to push for civics education rather than calling it economics, but civics as in generally how does our society work, the private sector and the public sector, and you can get into all sorts of questions about society well-being in general, not just about economic analysis and economic ideas, but have those in there as well. So I'm wondering, is there any effort that the ESA is putting towards trying to crack the curriculum setting monster?
I think the short answer is not currently, but it's a really interesting idea. We should talk further. Thank you. And I think at this point it only remains to thank our panellists, and I ask you to join me in doing that in the conventional way.